Dear participants, please note that we are noting the attendance from Microsoft Team. At the same time, we are also requesting each one of you to fill the attendance form, which is being shared at the end of every talk. This link will be active for 15 minutes only. We request your kind cooperation for the same.
A very good afternoon to one and all. It's it's a pleasure to introduce you to the speaker of second session, Dr. Ivan Scotino. In session 2, we are going to discuss the old world and the new world, its outlook on drug designing, development and discovery. I'll just briefly introduce Dr. Coutinho. He is a known figure to all of us. Dr. Coutinho has done his bachelor's from Parla College, University of Mumbai in 1981 and thereafter MSc and MSc Tech from UDCity, now known as Institute of Chemical Technology, University of Mumbai 1986. Thereafter, he did his PhD in pharmaceutical chemistry under the guidance of Dr. V.M. Kulkarni at Bombay College of Pharmacy in 1989. He has more than 34 years of teaching experience at Bombay College of Pharmacy. His interest lies in elucidation of peptide protein structures using 1D, 2D NMR techniques, strategic design of anti-infective agents using computer-assisted tools for drug design, understanding drug resistance using computer simulations. He has published close to 160 papers and 4 book chapters in the subject areas covering NMR studies on peptides, quantum chemical calculations, drug design techniques, and synthetic efforts to develop better anti-infective agents. He has 2 patents, that one of it is an active PCT of anti-tubercular agent acting against dormant stage of Mycobacterium, filed over a dozen of countries. He has supervised more than 45 master students and mentored 21 PhD students. He is a member of advisory committee, governing bodies, board of studies, and a recipient to numerous awards. With this brief introduction, I hand over the session to Dr. Coutinho. Sir, please take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Galvina, for this introduction. I hope I'm okay. As already been mentioned, I'm going to talk about something about New World and Old World outlook on drug discovery, design, and development. I want you to notice very carefully that I have not used versus Old World versus New World outlook. So this is not a lecture on comparison of traditional methods. I'm going to inference to you later on. Okay, so why am I interested in looking at the traditional methods? In current times, there is so much of emphasis on molecular modeling. And in the last few years, we have machine learning algorithms coming up, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and whatnot that is coming up. Why am I talking about the old world method? The traditional methods of drug discovery and development. I think there is still a lot that we can do with the traditional methods. And somehow, in our obsession for the newer methods of molecular modeling, we seem to have lots of the traditional methods of drug design. And so in the first half of my lecture, I'm going to give you a perspective of the traditional methods in drug design and discovery, which has given to us today more than 8% of our drugs and medicines that are used today, being prescribed today, all of them have their origins from these traditional methods. Okay, so I just want to put across to you all the traditional methods, and you make a final inference and a judgment of whether you want to adopt these traditional methods or you want to abandon them for the newer methods. Okay, before I present to you the new world and the old world outlook on drug design discovery, let me tell you, identifying leads and drug development is not a simple task. It is a multifactorial problem. The search space is so large that to identify the best leads that will make it past phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials and will be marketed and will be in the hands of doctors in order to administer for a particular disease is really like hitting from miles away. That's how difficult it is. And I repeat my statement in saying that drug design is a multifactorial. Okay, for example, most of our emphasis today is about activity, but activity is not all. So in this blue circle other set of compounds which have very tight binding, high affinity. Okay, but in order to be successful, we also need to have these set of compounds that have a satisfactory metabolic profile. So in this purple circle are compounds which have what I call as a satisfactory metabolic profile. Not only that, we need to design molecules that are highly selective. And you know, one of the complaints with allopathy is that we have these side effects, and side effects basically ensue from our molecules hitting the off targets and toxicity, resulting into toxicity. So in this green sphere are the set of compounds a degree of. Hello, is there a problem?
Yes, sir. No, sir.
Nope.
You're audible.
No, I'm audible. No, okay, thank you. And in this red sphere are the set of molecules that have satisfactory physico-chemical properties out here. Now, these physico-chemical properties are necessary in order for your pharmaceutics people in order to make a suitable formulation. We should not forget that. Okay, so medicinal chemistry should also keep. Okay, somebody has to make something that is easy to administer, something that is patient acceptable out there. So you look at this. So you have a set of molecules which have high potency, another set of molecules, okay, which have good metabolic profile, and another set of molecules with good selectivity and satisfactory physico-chemical properties out there. But what we want is we want that set of molecules within this sphere, that union of good potency, satisfactory metabolism, high selectivity, and appropriate physico-chemical properties out here. This is the bullseye where we have to hit. Okay, so which are these set of molecules that have all these satisfactory properties that will make them successful past phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, and we can put it into the hands of the general practitioners in order to administer it for a particular disease state. So you see how difficult it is. And in order to this, we had to design several thousands of compounds in order to have a handful of molecules, okay, with all the satisfactory properties of potency, metabolism, selectivity, and physico-chemical properties out here. Today, with the modern tools of molecular modeling, okay, we can limit that number of molecules that have to be made in order to have this satisfactory profile to hit this bull's eye out there. Okay, now molecular modeling can only enable us to develop those leads with these satisfactory properties that can go into phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. Now, if you look at the span, okay, of work that needs to be done before we can put a molecule into phase 1 and phase 2 trials, okay, it used to be a span of about 4 to 5 years in the past. Today, with the use of molecular modeling and all the tools that we have in drug design, we can limit 2 months. We have several successful examples where today, within 6 months from the drawing board to putting it into phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, we have been able to design very good molecules. And that is using the tools of molecular modeling. This has not only reduced the time, okay, to bring our drugs into phase 1 clinical trials, but has also helped to reduce the cost. Okay, now what can we do anything in order to limit that time? It takes about 6 to 7 years in order for a molecule to go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials without any heartbreak. Okay, can we do that? We are trying, but phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials has its own time limits, and that cannot be hastened. Okay, while we are trying to use today molecular modeling tools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, just in brief passing about physiologically based pharmacokinetics out here, which can help us in order to limit the time in phase 1 and phase 3 clinical trials. Effectively, we cannot reduce that 5 to 6 a year between these phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials there. So what I want you to appreciate that drug design right from inception stage right into putting it into the hands of the general practitioners takes something about 10 to 12 years. Okay, what we can do with our modern tools is to limit the initial time in drug design and discovery before we can put a molecule into phase 1 clinical trials. Limit that time to about 6 months to okay. So with this background, now let me give you a glimpse of the old world outlook of drug design and discovery out here. Okay, so in days past, in years past, okay, drug discovery used to be done just without a lead. And that was all about serendipity. We know how penicillin was discovered and how Librium was discovered. I have a slide, the next slide, which is going to talk to you a little bit about Librium, the discovery of chlordiazepor oxide. These were the initial methods of serendipity. Later on, okay, methods began to be discovered, okay, or to be used from starting from an existing molecule to develop it into a new lead. Okay, so let me look at the discovery of chlordiazepor oxide or Librium. Okay, I'm purposely putting this slide out here because I know that many of us are not familiar with how Librium was discovered out here. Librium was actually discovered in the laboratories at Roche. Okay, Dr. Sternbach at Roche wanted actually to make this set of compounds, benz heptoxdiazines. Okay, so a benzene ring that is fused to a 7-membered ring that has both 2 nitrogens, so dia, and oxygen, so heptoxdiazine out here. This and the molecules that were envisioned to be made with substitutions at R1, R2, and X5 on the phenyl ring. Okay, so while they were trying to make these compounds with these substituents, they were not successful in making the benz heptoxdiazine. Actually, they produced quinazoline 3 oxides. And they tested this for the activities that they were interested in. These molecules, quinazoline 3 oxides, were not interesting, and they were abandoned out here. So this project was then shelved out here. However, one of the chemists who was cleaning up his locker, okay, all the compounds that he had made, he wanted to discard them. He had one vial which he thought actually contained this structure with R1 equal to methyl amino methyl, X equal to Cl, and R2 equal to a phenyl ring. He thought that he had made such a molecule out here. But for some reasons, I do not know what a hunch he had, he decided to give it back for NMR structural elucidation. Okay, I do not know the reason. What was his hunch? And to his surprise, okay, the structure which NMR turned out was this benzdiazepine 4 oxide, and they were stunned. They had all expected that quinazoline 3 oxides, but actually for one particular set of substitution, what they actually made was chlordiazepor oxide. This was a benz, and this was the origin of all your molecules which are today used for treatment as tranquilizers, sedative, hypnotics, and tranquilizers. Okay, so you begin to see what they surmised, what they thought, what was very well planned and thought of, actually did not go the way that they envisioned out here. Okay, and for some reasons or the other, they landed up with one of the molecules which today is a mainstay in for treatment of sedative, hypnotics, and as a tranquilizer. So sometimes if you get things during your synthesis which you don't expect, what I would always say that don't discard it into your dustbin. Give it a second thought. You may be sitting on a gold mine. I know that many of you may be smiling out here. Actually, we found out some molecules that we thought were quite different in their structure, and we actually positioned them for some other activity out here. So all that I want to conclude from this talk is things don't go as you planned them. Somehow your synthesis is not working in the manner that you planned out to them, and you're getting some very obscure molecules. Put a little more effort, investigate them further, and you may be surprised on the outcome out here. Okay, so you all know about random screening, and I don't need to talk a lot about this. Okay, random screening, which was the mainstay of drug discovery in the 1940s and 1950s, have given us the antibiotics out there. Okay, so random screening from plants and animals have given us a lot of compounds: aspirin, cocaine, atropine, then your ACE inhibitors for treatment of hypertension, captopril, quinine as an anti-malarial out here. But what is the problem in screening higher plants and animals? The problem is that most of these structures, okay, with the except of aspirin, which I've listed out here, most of them are quite complicated. They have incredible molecular complexities. You all know that these plant products have very complicated structures. And then the process of drug discovery, converting these extremely complicated molecular structures into something that is very simple and easy to make, is a very slow process out here. So this is the drawback. The drawback is that many of the compounds that are present in the higher plants and animals have too complicated structures that optimizing them, okay, for the activity is a slow, drawn out process out here. Okay, coming down to the arthropods and the insects, and from insects, we do not have too much of success in this area. Fermentation, I need not talk about out there. Okay, fermentation has given us the full class of antibiotics, but also has given us the cholesterol reducing agents, the statins out there. Okay, marine products also not too very successful. We have not gotten too many compounds from marine sources. The problem that is molecules from marine sources that all that have been isolated have turned out to be too toxic, or their spectrum of activity has turned out to be too narrow to be useful in medicine out there. Okay, so the earlier approaches that I talked about were very random approaches. You isolated a compound irrespective of its structure. Okay, you just screened it, okay, for some sort of activity out here. Now, the non-random approaches or the targeted or the focused screening approach gives some regard to structure. Okay, you begin to actually screen compounds that are related to something that you already know, to some existing lead or to some existing molecule out here. So you do not screen irregard of the structure. So your screening is focused. You begin to screen, okay, for that particular activity, if you know the molecules that you have isolated from the natural sources has some resemblance to known leads or to known drugs in a particular therapeutic context out here. And here I want to talk about keeping your eye vigilant in what is happening in the clinics. Okay, so many times in phase 4 clinical, in the phase 4 trials out here, we must be vigilant. Okay, and we must ask the general practitioners to report any unseen events out here, because these observations, okay, what is happening in the clinic has given us so many other molecules. For example, diamond hydronate. Okay, this is the structure, diamond hydronate. Okay, it was originally intended as an antihistamine agent, but in the clinics, it was found to suppress motion sickness. And now the drug is also marketed, besides being marketed as an antihistamine, it's also being marketed and prescribed for the treatment of motion sickness. Bupropion, okay, that is its structure. initially identified, it was actually found to be helping in smoking cessation out there. Okay, and today it is a drug which is prescribed for smoking. And our best example here of Viagra, sildenafil citrate, originally intended as an anti-hypertensive agent, but later, okay, in the clinics found out to be more useful for the treatment of erectile dysfunction. And today it is being marketed only for this effect out here. So what I want you to emphasize is that we must be a little vigilant and more observant, okay, at what is happening in the clinical trials, and we may be surprised at what we may find. Okay, drug metabolism studies also have given us new compounds. For example, terfenadine. We know that terfenadine is metabolized. One of the methyl groups is actually, and then to a carboxylic acid, and that is the metabolite fexofenadine. So today, fexofenadine, the metabolite, is actually marketed, and it has had much better effects than terfenadine. Another example of a metabolite that is actually being marketed today in place of the original drug is Sulindac, an anti-inflammatory agent. Okay, the metabolite is basically the removal of the S oxide. Okay, it is the sulfide, and actually the metabolite, when you administer it in vivo, it is connected to Sulindac, which is the active agent. Okay, so today what is happening is the metabolite is being administered. What is the advantage in administering the metabolite over Sulindac? It is less polar. Okay, sulfoxide quite polar. The metabolite is the sulfide, which is less polar, and you have this advantage. Being less polar, you have several advantages in pharmacokinetics. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about the rational approaches that have been used in drug design. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Okay, so you know all about progesterone, the female sex hormone. Okay, from progesterone, systematic modifications have led to norgestrone, contraceptive. So look at the modifications that have been made out here. The acetyl group has been modified to an acetylenic compound. Okay, so starting from the natural substrate, a series of modifications has converted the natural activity to this oral contraceptive agent out here. Okay, coming down to histamine, you all know, okay, the pharmacological actions of histamine. Okay, look at that structure here. We have the indole ring here that has been sequentially modified to give us indomethacin, which is an NSAID. Okay, so starting from natural molecules, making systematic modifications, intelligent systematic modifications, we can identify and develop new drugs. Okay, so coming down to lead modification. Now, when we have a natural molecule, okay, and we want to find out which part of this natural molecule, that is identifying the pharmacophore. Okay, most of the natural molecules, the bulk of the natural molecule, okay, is basically referred to as the oxophore. Okay, so how do we cut off the unnecessary parts? And I'll put that in quotes. Okay, what do I mean by the unnecessary part? Strip off the oxophore and help us to identify the pharmacophore. Okay, the most important part of the molecule that is responsible for interaction with the receptor out here. I'll illustrate this example with what was done with morphine. Okay. Okay, you all know the structure of morphine and you know how complicated it is. It has a series of rings, okay, as you can see here, illustrated out here. Now, the pharmacophore of morphine is outlined in red. Okay, how that has been identified, I'm going to trace this out to you. Okay. So what was done first? First was they cut off this dihydrofuran ring. Okay, now it is very easy to say just cut off, but actually what we have to make, this 1, 2, 3, 4, this tetracyclic molecule without the fifth ring out here. So this molecule was actually synthesized without the furan ring, and that gave us levorphenol. Okay. Now, coming down from morphine to levorphenol, we want to ask ourselves, what has happened to the activity? More important, what has happened to the addiction potential of morphine? Okay. We want to address that most important property. We don't mind sacrificing some amount of the activity, but most important, we want to know whether we have brought a reduction in this addiction potential out here. Okay, so rooming out, incising out the dihydrofuran ring to get you levorphenol. Levorphenol than morphine. Now that is inconsequential. Okay, morphine is so active as an analgesic. Really, we do not need for human use anything that is more potent than morphine out here. We are interested in actually whether we are able to remove the addictive potential out here. Sadly, removing the dihydrofuran ring has not able to lessen the addictive potential of levorphenol. Anyway, we have made a simpler structure out here. Let's go further. Now we cut off the cyclohexene ring. We cut this off out here. Okay, we can cut this out here, and now we have a tricyclic molecule, which is nothing but pentazocine. Okay, and we ask ourselves this question: what about the activity, and more importantly, what about the addiction potential out here? Here we have pentazocine. Okay, has a lower addiction potential than morphine. Okay, pentazocine has slightly less analgesic power. That doesn't matter. We know morphine is very potent, so we have lost some potency, but that doesn't matter. Most important is what we have gained is we have lowered the addiction potential. Going further, cut away now the cyclohexane ring, this part. We cut away the cyclohexane ring out here, and we get a very simple molecule, meperidine, a piperidine analog. Very easy to synthesize this molecule. In fact, you can make this molecule even in the laboratory. You can actually do a 4th-year synthesis to make this molecule. It is very simple, starting from 4-oxo-piperidine. Now, how did we fare now? When we took out this cyclohexane ring, okay, as far as the analgesic activity in animal test, we have not sacrificed too much on the analgesic activity out here. Okay, in other tests, we see that we have quite a drop in the analgesic activity. Okay, almost an 80 to 94 loss, but that doesn't matter. As I said, morphine is very potent out here. We still have quite a potent analgesic compound out here, but meperidine has lost all of its addiction potential that is associated with morphine out here. So you see, by a series of structural modifications out here, we have been quite useful as an analgesic, but without the addiction potential that is associated with morphine out here. Now, this is a tedious exercise. Okay, a tedious exercise, what I've shown to you. But in the past, that was all that they could do. Okay, they had to make these several modifications, make these synthetic molecules without these complicated ring structures. Okay, slowly modify them and identify the in pharmacophore mapping. We can do this in a matter of less than an hour out here. And I'll be talking a little bit about pharmacophore modeling a little later on out here. Okay, so this was a traditional method, painstaking method, but nevertheless, this was achieved for many compounds, for many natural products. I've shown here as an example of morphine, but the same thing was achieved for a large number of other compounds, even for cocaine. You can read that in in the literature. And the final thing that was done, okay, you cut open the piperidine ring and you have dextropropoxyphene. Okay, today it is present in so many of our cough syrups out here. Okay, so dextropropoxyphene, when we compare it with codeine, it has 1/3 to 2/3 of the activity of codeine, and about 13% of the activity of morphine. And a little bit I want to talk to you about isosteres, the value of making isosteres. Now, you all are pharmacists, you know the definition of what are isosteres. I won't spend time on defining what are isosteres. Here is a table of all univalent, bivalent, trivalent, and tetravalent isosteric replacements that can be made, and ring equivalents. This has been very, very productive. Okay, replacing, for example, a benzene ring with a thiophene ring, or a benzene ring with a pyridine ring. A lot of new leads have been derived by making this isosteric replacement out here. And also the isosteres, tetrahydrofuran is isosteric with tetrahydrothiophene and with pyrrolidine. Okay, so ring equivalents have been the most successful in this gamut of classical isosteres. Here is a little bit of uracil, and 5-fluorouracil, which is used in cancer therapy. Yeah, the isosteric replacement is basically a replacement of the hydrogen at the 5 position with fluorine. Okay, fluorine is an isostere of hydrogen out here, and making this very simple isosteric replacement, now we have designed an anti-cancer agent out here. Bioisosteres. Okay, as a pharmacist, you know what are bioisosteres, but I'll just repeat this in a few words. These are substituents or groups that have the same chemical or physical properties and which broadly produce the same biological properties. Okay, so here are some examples of bioisosteres. Okay, I will give you one example of a bioisosteric replacement. You all know PABA. Okay, PABA, one of the central compounds in the synthesis of folic acid. We have made this bioisosteric replacement with the carboxylic acid in PABA has been replaced with a sulfanilamide, and the sulfonamide, and this has given rise to the sulfonamides, which were the mainstay in treatment as an antibacterial agent, but nowadays which have been supplanted by the much better antibiotics. For several years, the sulfonamides, okay, were the mainstay of treatment of bacterial infections. Typically, they are used, okay, for some eye infections and for some urinary tract infections, but largely they have been replaced as an antibacterial agent by the antibiotics out here. So you begin to see here an isosteric replacement of a carboxylic acid with a sulfonamide has been very useful in lead design out here. A little bit about the other approaches, okay? I don't have time to talk a lot about the other approaches. I thought in the next half an hour, I'll switch on to the modern methods, the new world methods. But I want to talk a little bit about peptidomimetics, okay? You know peptides, all of you know peptides have these problems, okay, of administration. They're hydrolyzed in the GI tract. They have poor oral absorption, poor distribution, poor excretion. And because of the flexibility, they bind to multiple receptors, okay, to off targets which are responsible for their side effects so these are the problems with peptides, and you know that people in pharmaceutics and in pharmaceutical chemistry are working a lot in order to overcome these problems. Okay, one of the strategies that chemists use, okay, is basically what are called as making peptidomimetics. Peptidomimetics, as the word implies, okay, they mimic the action of the peptides, but are devoid of all of these problems that are associated with the peptides: poor oral absorption and binding to multiple targets. Okay, so peptidomimetics, they mimic the action of the peptides, but are without the problems that are associated with the peptides. So how do we make peptidomimetics out here? Okay, so you can make in the natural peptides, you can make various structural modifications. One of the problems that I talked about peptides is basically about an amino acid. If you look at a peptide, you have these backbone torsion angles, phi and psi, and in the side chain, you have these chi torsion angles, which means that they are very flexible. And this flexibility causes them to bind to multiple receptors or to off-receptor targets. So how do we constrain the flexibility of these amino acids? So you can put, groups at the ortho positions in order to prevent rotation about this angle. This is the side chain angle chi1. Okay, this is incidentally related to tyrosine. Okay, so by putting these two methyl groups at the ortho positions in the, you can block the flexibility of the side chain. You can limit the number actually adopt. More importantly, what you can do is make a ring structure. Okay, this is the alpha carbon atom. I have joined the alpha carbon atom into the phenyl ring and made a compound like this, okay, which is now very, very inflexible. Here are some other examples of constraining the side chain and making analogs. Here is an indole 2-carboxylic acid derivative out here, which can be looked at a constrained analog of phenylalanine out here. So what are the advantages in constraining the amino acids? Is that you limit their flexibility and that you therefore can improve their their binding to a very specific target. Okay. Another very useful strategy is to do this isosteric replacement of groups in the backbone. Okay, so here is the peptide backbone out here. You can replace the amino group with oxygen, with nitrogen, or with methylene, or you can replace the alpha carbon atom with nitrogen, or with a carbon atom that is di-substituted. So you replace this H with another R group out there. Okay, you can replace the carbonyl with the thio, or with the methylene out here. Okay, so all these modifications basically can be made. You can make a reverse amide. Okay, you can change the CONH to an NHCO. You can put a hydroxyethylene. You can replace the amide with a hydroxyethylene. This strategy, okay, of replacing the amide functionality or the amide moiety with the hydroxyethylene has been very useful in the design of HIV agents. Okay, and the last approach is you can replace the amide with an ethylene. Okay, so you can make these isosteric replacements, and then you can actually overcome that are associated with the peptides. Hydrolysis, you can overcome hydrolysis. So once you have modified the amide, for example, to any one of these structures, then the issue of hydrolysis doesn't crop in out here. Okay, so you can limit hydrolysis and then you can improve bioavailability. Okay, so I think I will stop here, and I'm going to now, in the next half an hour, very briefly review the new world methods. Okay, this is nothing other than molecular modeling. So what is molecular modeling out here? In chemistry, we are all familiar with a model. A model is actually nothing, a bridge between theory and experiment. In other words, a model fills the gap between familiar with space filling model. Here is basically a Connolly model. What is a Connolly model? A Connolly model is basically you roll a probe, that is you roll a water molecule over the van der Waals surface of your molecule out here. And that gives you basically the wettability, the wettable surface. Okay. This is basically the wettable surface, where this is the surface where it can actually interact with water molecules out. And this is called the Connolly surface. All of you are familiar with van der Waals surface. Okay. Now, these are all models. Okay, so you're familiar with the ball and stick model, you're familiar with the Van der Waals surface model, and here I've shown you the Connolly surface, which is nothing but about the wettability, the surface which actually is wetted by water molecules when you put this molecule into solution. But what actually is molecular modeling? Molecular modeling is much more than what I've talked to you about, these simple three-dimensional models out here. Yes, we do make three-dimensional models in molecular modeling out here, but we make three-dimensional models over which we can calculate different properties. A vast array of properties can be computed. Physico-chemical properties, properties related to magnetic, thermal, any other, all properties, whatever we can think of, electrical properties. All these properties actually can be computed once we make a three-dimensional model of a molecule. Besides computing various properties such as thermal, electrical, mechanical, and even our activity, okay, our biological activity, we can also study the relationship between molecular structure and basically any of these desired properties out here. We can understand this link between the structure and the property. So what is this where I'm trying to say? If I modify the structure, I can immediately find out what changes do I make in the property. In our context, in pharmacy context, is what changes do I make in the binding affinity? Or what changes do I make in the physico-chemical properties? Or for others, what changes if I modify this structure, if I tweak this structure, if I alter this functional group? What happens to, for example, the magnetic properties of this molecule, to the thermal properties of this molecule, to the electrical properties of this molecule? Now, not only that, we can understand this relationship between structure and all of these various properties, but we can also model chemical reactions and kinetics. So it is not only thermodynamic properties in which we can compute, basically these are the ground state properties, but we can also compute basically chemical reaction and kinetics, which are related to basically transition states. So that is the power of molecular modeling. Once I have a three-dimensional structure, I can model the ground state as well as the transition state. And it is modeling basically the transition states, which basically let me compute rates of the reaction. They can help me to compute kinetics. So that is the power in molecular modeling out here. So coming down to our field in pharmacy out here, I can actually compute several observable properties like hydrophobicity, molecular weight, molecular refractivities, okay, the HOMOR and the LUMOR energies, the ionization, electron affinities, thermodynamic properties like enthalpy, entropy, free energy, chemical potential, heat capacities, etc. Then okay, how two molecules interact with each other, the interaction of two molecules out here, and then I can compute their binding affinities, how these two molecules have affinities for each other, the free energy of a small molecule to a macromolecule or another macromolecule to another macromolecule. All of these properties can easily be computed used by molecular modeling out here. Okay, so coming down now to drug design, okay? All of you know these phases basically in drug design. Okay, there is target identification, there is target validation. From lead identifications, we identify leads, we optimize leads, and then we take them into your phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. Today in molecular modeling, we can do both downstream modeling and upstream modeling out here, right up to modeling even clinical trials. Okay, we have tools today, even modeling clinical trials. Okay, so basically, you have the state of the art today in physiologically based pharmacokinetic simulations out here. Okay, you can do population kinetics, whatever you want to do in clinical trials. It is possible today to have software, okay, to buy software. All your of clinical trials today. So today, molecular modeling spans the full gamut in drug design. Right from early drug discovery, from target identification, we have tools, we have software for identifying targets, to validating targets, whether they are druggable or not. And once I have a target on my hand, I can identify small molecules which can bind to this target, which can modulate these targets. And once I have identified small molecules that can modulate these targets, I can optimize them, okay, optimize them, improve their affinity, okay, improve their pharmacokinetics, improve their metabolic profile, and then take them into phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials out here. So what I want to conclude from this slide is that we have today tools, molecular modeling tools, to both do modeling for the upstream elements as well as for the downstream elements, like in silico admit prediction and PBPK, physiologically based pharmacokinetic simulations out here. Okay, I will basically focus on one aspect about affinity. Okay, there is how we can improve, for example, metabolism, how we can improve pharmacokinetics. Okay, though I wish that I could have spoken all about this thing, I will focus in this lecture a little bit about the tools and the methods that we have for improving affinity. So for doing this, we have the two paradigms of molecular modeling. And what are the two paradigms? One is ligand-based drug discovery methods, and the other is structure-based drug discovery methods. Now, what is the difference between these two methodologies or these two platforms? In ligand-based discovery methods, okay, essentially we only use molecules, the structures of molecules, okay, of existing known molecules which have been reported in the literature to have a certain. We use the properties of these existing molecules which are published in the literature to develop new. In structure-based drug design, basically what we use is the macromolecular target. We use information about the target, the enzyme structure or the receptor structure. The receptor could be a DNA. It could be a receptor in this actual meaning itself, a GPCR or an ion channel receptor or a kinase receptor. We could use these structures and use these identify new leads. So the question is now, which one is better? Which of the two paradigms is better? Is ligand-based discovery better than structure-based discovery? The question is not which one is better. The question depends upon what information do I have at hand. If I have no information about the pharmacological target, then obviously the structure-based drug discovery methods are not applicable. If all the information I have is about molecules which have a certain information that I have, then obviously I have to limit myself to the ligand-based drug discovery methodology. If I have information with both, with the ligands and as well as the macromolecular targets, the structures of the enzymes or the receptors or the DNA, and then I'm in a very enviable situation out here. Then I can do a lot more, okay? When I have both information, I can do a lot more. And it's the most powerful tool at hand. If you have access to known ligands, or structure of the targets, three-dimensional structures of the targets, then you are in a very enviable position out here. Actually, you can harness all this information, okay, to get the best out of the two knowledge domains out here. So here is a nice little picture where I've divided the strategies into these four quadrants. So on the y-axis is basically information about the ligands, and on the x-axis is basically the information about the targets. Okay, so here we see the four quadrants. If you have information about ligands, but you have no information about the target structure, then you're sitting in this quadrant, and the tools that you are going to basically use is pharmacophore mapping, and you're going to use ligand similarity QSAR methods. You're going to use basically QSAR methods. So the two paradigms that you're going to use when you have only information about the ligands, no information about target structures, you're going to adopt pharmacophore mapping and QSAR. If you have no information about the ligands, nothing, and no information about the target structures, and this is in a very bad position to use, then you have to use screening methods. Then you can resort to the methods that I've told you about, the old world methods. You can actually resort to the old world methods in order to start your drug design programs. Okay, or you could use combinatorial chemistry, and high throughput screening in order to design your libraries out here. Okay. In the 1980s and the 1980s, there was a lot of hype about combinatorial chemistry, and a lot was expected from combinatorial chemistry in order to give us new leads. However, sadly, combinatorial chemistry did not actually live to its reputation out here. So somehow combinatorial chemistry has now lost its focus, lost its role, even though a huge amount of research work was done into doing more focused combinatorial chemistry work out here. For some reason, chemistry did not live up to its name. So to conclude, okay, I would say now, if you have no information about any ligands or about the targets, you can use any of the traditional methods that I just talked about earlier in order to identify new leads. Now, here is a very enviable position. You know the structure of the target, and this is the richest information that you could ever have out here. This is an enviable position to be at. You could use structure-based drug design, also referred to as de novo drug design, and you could use ligand contact analysis method, bound ligand morphing methods. You could use many methods in order to design new leads. And this is the most productive quadrant out here. Okay, if you have structures of the targets, but you have no ligands that modulate this target, that bind to these targets, then you can use de novo design. You can use virtual ligand screening and virtual target screening. Okay, so now I have just 15 minutes left out here, and I'm going to very briefly touch upon these methods out here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm a pharmacist, just like most of you, but I find that quantum, in molecular modeling. Okay, I'm not going to give you the background of quantum mechanics, nor give you any or make any attempt to how to solve the Schrodinger equation. Okay, this is not expected to be a class of that type out here, but I'm going to talk to you about the power of quantum mechanics, what we can get from quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics basically involves solving this Schrodinger equation. Okay, now this is called as an eigenvalue equation. Please don't imply that you can calculate psi r from both sides of this equation. Basically, and this embodies everything that ever you wanted to know about your molecule. All information is contained in this wave function. It's a very complicated function. It's a function of the electron coordinates as well as the nuclear coordinates as well as the spin coordinate, the spin coordinates out here. From this wave function, if you are able to construct the wave function, what you do is you basically can operate on this wave function with various operators, and you can extract a huge number of properties from that wave function about the molecule. So here we have, for example, H is the Hamiltonian, and when you operate with the Hamiltonian onto the wave function, what you extract is the energy out here. And this energy is very intrinsic in molecular modeling. In fact, if you do not have this energy out here, we can do nothing in molecular modeling out here. So one of the fundamental properties that molecular modeling hinges upon is this ability to accurately calculate the energy of a molecule for all its states, for all its conformations, for all its ionization, everything. If we can calculate the energy, then we can do a lot from it. Okay, so after we have the wave function, we can not only compute the energies, but we can do a lot of other things. We can also calculate a huge number of molecular properties. We can calculate orbital energies. We can calculate ionization potential. As I said earlier, electron affinities, dipole moments, quadrupole moments, and the higher moments, even octupole moments. And we can calculate the electron density. And this is the most important property, rho of R. From the electron density, we can compute this very important property, the electrostatic potential. Utility potential. I'm not going to show you how the equation for calculating the electrostatic potential, but if we can calculate the electron density, which is very easy to do once we solve the Schrodinger equation from the electron density, we can actually calculate the electrostatic potential out here. Okay, this is how it looks. Okay, this is the electrostatic potential actually mapped on the surface of a very small molecule formamide. Okay, the electrostatic potential actually is given out in electron volts in numbers out here. But you know, pictures are much better than numbers out here. So what this negative and positive. So the numbers are both negative as well as positive out here. So what these numbers are basically done, they're color coded, and then they are mapped onto the electron density surface of the molecule out here. Okay, so you see this area, this red area on formamide, it is actually a negative electrostatic potential. So the potential here is basically minus. And you can see here this area on formamide, okay, which is blue in color, it is basically electropositive. So the values here of the molecular electrostatic potential is basically positive. Now you ask ourselves, okay, so what does this all mean? I'll tell you the implications of this and how we can use this in drug design. This yellow and green area tell you basically that the electrostatic potential is very close to neutrality. That is, the values hover around the vicinity of zero, neither positive or neither negative. So values that hover around zero are basically color coded as this green and this yellow and this yellow shades out here. So here is dopamine. Okay, you all know today the significance of dopamine and basically the role that it plays in the brain. Here, electrostatic potential that has been computed for dopamine, and here you can see and you can see how now the values are transformed into these color shades out here. So the most negative potential out here is red in color, and you can see where this negative potential lies. It lies in the vicinity of the two hydroxy groups of dopamine on the phenyl ring, and you can see this electropositive potential, blue color. Okay, the blue color is around the amine portion out here. Okay, and you can see the other parts which are color coded, how this potential changes out here. Okay, now let me focus on this red and this blue parts and this blue part out here. Okay, this electrostatic potential molecules will interact with each other, and I'm going to show you this. Okay, so this is the dopaminergic receptor out here. Okay, this part is basically the dopaminergic receptor, and what we are looking at is actually the binding site where dopamine binds. And what has been done here, what I have done, I have calculated the electrostatic potential for this binding surface out here. And now you begin to see how dopamine binds. So here I have a positive potential in the binding site of dopamine receptor, and you can see, okay, that dopamine will bind with a negative potential oriented towards the positive potential on the binding site. In dopamine will orient itself in a negative potential inside the receptor route. So there is this complementarity. So when a molecule binds inside the receptor, one of the most important features, besides it having a snug fit, okay, that a fit that also is dependent upon the shape, another very important property is that the electrostatic potential should actually match. So there should be complementarity. So when we map the electrostatic potential, we get a very good idea about how a molecule will bind inside the. If we have this information, okay, we can do a lot out here. Okay, so let me take this example out here. Okay, so let me say out here. So you see this part of the molecule, it is binding in a region of neutrality out here. Okay, so what I can do now, I can actually modify this area, okay, with groups that are neither electropositive, neither electronegative out here. So I can put, for example, a methyl group here. And a methyl group will fit very nicely because the methyl group is not almost very close to neutrality, and this will bind inside this potential area inside your in a receptor pocket out here. So once we have this idea, you can make structural modifications accordingly. Or here, if you want, you can put actually more electronegative atoms out here so that the binding affinity will increase out here. Okay, so this gives us idea about how molecules bind to each other, and you can also use electrostatic potentials in order to access similarities between two molecules. So if you have two molecules and you want to ask yourself this question, will my other molecule behave and bind exactly as my first molecule outside? One of the ways in which to address this question is for the two molecules, you calculate the electrostatic potentials, and then you superimpose upon them on each other with a little bit of translations and rotations, and you see whether you get a if there is a good match in the electrostatic similarities and the electrostatic potentials of these two molecules, then you can go with confidence and say that these two molecules will behave exactly in a like fashion. Maybe they have the same sort of activity, maybe they have the same sort of magnetic properties, or maybe they have the same sort of electrical properties. You can go and say that with great confidence out here. Okay, so now my time is running out here. I have another 10 minutes and I have a lot to talk about out here. Okay, so I emphasize this fact that calculating the energy of a molecule is very intrinsic in molecular modeling. Okay, I showed you that you can calculate the energy very accurately by solving the Schrodinger equation. But to calculate the Schrodinger equation with all its assumption out here is not a trivial task. Okay, it's very, very complicated. It's very, very complicated because molecular integrals that must be in fact, this molecular integrals, goes in an exponential fashion. The more the number of electrons that you have in your system, the molecular integrals actually balloons out in an exponential fashion out here. Okay, so even if I have a small size molecules, there are millions of molecular integrals that must be actually evaluated in order to solve the Schrodinger equation, which makes the problem of quantum mechanical calculations for molecules very, very difficult out here. Even if you have very powerful computers, okay, to calculate, for example, to solve the Schrodinger equation, even for a very small enzyme, today is out of bounds. Today, with very powerful computers, you can actually solve the Schrodinger equation for atoms which are for molecules which have about 200 to 300 atoms out here. Or you can extend that even further if you have very powerful computers out here, which means it is just out of bound for our molecular targets. We cannot solve the Schrodinger equation for basically enzymes or for DNAs or for lipids which are of interest to us. They're just out of bounds. They're too huge numbers. They have 1,000 atoms or 2,000 or 3,000 atoms, which is just not possible today with today's technologies, okay, with to calculate the Schrodinger equation out here. So people have used other methods, and one of the ways of simplifying, okay, the methodology to calculate the energy of a molecule is this molecular mechanics method out here. Okay, so here now, this molecular mechanics energy is a very empirical method of calculating the energy. And of bond stretching, angle bending, torsion rotation are some of the van der Waals interactions and some of the electrostatic interactions out there. Okay, so that is the sum total of the energy. You sum over all the bonds, all the angles, all the torsions, all the non-bonded pairs, okay, and here, okay, that are involved in van der Waals interactions and in basically in Coulombic interactions out here. So that's a very simplified energy equation out here. Okay, I can't go into details. There is no time out here, but it is 1,000 atoms in a Jeffy. You will be able to compute to compute the energy, because the energy equation is very, very simple out here. Okay, so the molecular mechanics method have replaced the quantum mechanical methods, okay, to calculate the energy of a molecule. And today, to calculate the energy, you're not limited by the size of the molecule. You can have several thousands of atoms. Your molecule you may have a very large enzyme. You're still able to calculate the energy of the molecule in a jiffy. How accurate are we? That's but with a fair degree of accuracy, you can calculate the energy, the energy of most type of molecules out here. So this is called basically I have a force field. So we have force fields that are basically written very specifically for different types of molecules. For example, you have force fields which are written for peptides, okay, for proteins. You have force fields which have been written for for DNAs, we have force fields which have been written. For carbohydrates, we have force fields which are written basically for lipids, for lipid molecules out here. But you have also very generalized force fields. That means force fields which you can use to calculate the energy across all types of, it's a peptide, whether it's a DNA structure, whether it's an oligonucleotide, also you have very generalized force fields out here. Okay, and the degree of accuracy all varies. But what I'm trying to say is that molecular mechanics has given us the ability to calculate the energy very quickly and with a reasonable level of accuracy for molecules, for macro molecules out here. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the different methods in molecular modeling out here. So we have this homology modeling. So what homology modeling enables us to do? Okay, so homology modeling is based upon using of a homology modeling. Basically, if I refer it to building structures of proteins, okay, or building structures of protein, what I use is I use a template. A template is another protein which belongs to the same family of my target protein whose structure I'm trying to build. Okay, so I use a template whose structure has been determined chiefly by X-ray crystallography, and I use this template, okay, to actually translate the structure into my target protein out here. This all hinges about one thing, okay, the ability to translate the structure from one protein in hinges upon two fundamental pieces out here. One is basically how do I align these two structures, and then how do I identify what are called as structurally conserved regions for my template. Okay, if I can do this, I can use the alignment and the structures of the structurally conserved regions. What are the structurally conserved regions? These are the alpha helices and the beta sheets. I can use these structures of alpha helices and beta sheets in order to translate it out into parts into my unknown and into my unknown structures out here. Okay, to say this very briefly, okay, homology modeling helps me to build structures for new proteins that I have determined, whose all that information that I have is basically the sequence of amino acids. If I just know the sequence of amino acids, I can use a template structure in order to assign a structure to my new protein. Okay, so once I have these structures of this, I can do a lot. Okay, for example, I can use this three-dimensional structure. Okay, let me quickly run through this. Basically, to do structure-based drug design. Okay, so let me talk about structure-based drug design, or de novo drug design. I need the three-dimensional structure of the receptor out here. Okay, so where do I get three-dimensional structures of a receptor? The best three-dimensional structures of a receptor are from X-ray crystallography. Now there are several caveats to that also. Okay, I don't have time to talk about the caveats out here. Okay, but I believe that one of the best 3D structures is from X-ray crystallography. You get 3D structures also from NMR. They are called as solution structures. NMR gives you what are called as ensemble of structures. You can use also NMR structures also, or structure by X-ray crystallography or by NMR. You can use homology modeling that I just talked about and use that structure in order to use structure-based drug design. Now, the methods in structure-based drug design are actually classified as class 1 methods and as class 2 methods. Class 1 methods are referred to as the outside-in methods, and the class 2 methods are basically referred to as the inside-out methods. Let me illustrate you by taking an example out here. Okay, so here I'm going to basically show you this outline, a two-dimensional representation of your 3D structure of your enzyme. Okay, so the first thing that the programs in structure-based drug design will do basically will scout this binding site and look for what are the elements that are present inside the binding site. Okay, for example, here it has identified in the binding site there is an isoleucine 56. So isoleucine 56 is basically an hydrophobic amino acid hydrophobic amino acid out here. So what it does, it marks this patch as green, telling you that this is a hydrophobic pocket out here. Okay, so okay, sorry. Okay, so what it has identified that here in this, here in the active site, okay, we have the NH group, the NH group of isoleucine, which is actually protruding inside the binding site out here. Now, what is this NH group? This NH group is a hydrogen bond donor. So what the program actually begins to do. Okay, what are these vectors? These vectors are showing you that where a hydrogen bond acceptor can orient itself in order to make strong hydrogen bond interactions out here. Okay, so these vectors are pointing you about the possibility that a hydrogen bond acceptor can make interactions with the NH group, which is a hydrogen bond donor out here. In this area is a phenylalanine group out here. Now, phenylalanine has a phenyl ring, which is hydrophobic out here. And so what it has done, basically, it has demarcated the hydrophobic pocket by these blue dots, okay, telling you that there's a hydrophobic patch out here. In this area, okay, the program has identified we have the side chain of aspartic acid at position 37 in this protein, and there is a carboxylic group that protrudes into the binding site. Now, the carboxylic acid group is basically ionized, and so you can have electrostatic interaction. Vectors for all possible directions in which you can make electrostatic interactions out here. Okay, so now you have identified all possible interactions inside the active site. So you have a hydrogen bond donor, you have a hydrophobic site, and you have an electrostatic interaction site out here. So what you can do now, you can position appropriate groups that can take advantage of these interactions out here. Okay, so let me illustrate out here. So I have an NH group inside the active site that is coming from isoleucine 56. It is the hydrogen bond donor. So I position a hydrogen bond acceptor. Okay, so let me. Okay, so I position a hydrogen bond acceptor in one of these vectors out here. So you can see the carbonyl group actually is being oriented in one of these vectors out here. With the carbonyl, okay, with the carbonyl oriented along one of these vectors in order to make strong hydrogen bond interactions out here. Okay, so here I have a hydrophobic pocket. Okay, that hydrophobic pocket is coming from the side chain of phenylalanine at position 46. So what I have done is I have basically put a hydrophobic group like benzene out here because it can make hydrophobic interactions with the benzene ring in the active site. So you can have these hydrophobic interactions, pi stacking interactions out here. Okay, here I have an aspartic acid, okay, a carboxylic group of aspartic acid, okay, and I've only represented by the CO group, okay, there is an electrostatic interactions, okay, it is negatively charged. So here I position an ammonium group in order to take advantage of this electrostatic interaction, negative and positive interactions out here. So what I've done is have positioned complementary groups inside the active site, a formaldehyde group, a benzene ring here, and an ammonium ion that makes complementary interactions with all these features that I've initially identified inside the active site. The next step is now to connect all of these pieces together in order to make a realistic molecule out here. So what the program does, it goes and looks at its database and it finds, pieces in the database which can let you connect the formaldehyde group to the benzene ring and connect the benzene ring into this ammonium group out here. It goes through several iterations, okay? It goes through several iterations. It'll pick up a lot of small fragments from its database, and depending upon the geometry of these pieces and the geometry of the fragments inside the database, and all of these pieces out here. Okay, so it'll go through several iterations. In the end, you see what it has done. See how it has very nicely connected the carbonyl group here with the benzene ring and with the ammonium group out here. Okay, now in another iteration, it could use another piece like here in order to connect this. It could use another fragment moiety in order to connect these pieces out here. Okay, so once it has made these connections, actually now you have constructed a real molecule, a lead molecule inside the active site. And we know it is going to bind very tightly because your lead molecule now has all features that are exactly complementary to the features that are there inside the binding site. It has a hydrogen bonding group which can take advantage of this hydrogen acceptor. It has a hydrophobic group which binds in a hydrophobic pocket. It has an ammonium group which will make electrostatic interactions out here. Now I've shown you a limited number of 3 interactions, but in a realistic case, you'll have many more interactions which you can take advantage of out here. Okay, so here is, lo and behold, okay, your structure-based drug design algorithm has built for you a nice molecule inside the active site out here. Okay, but now when you look at this molecule, okay, some of you who are chemists would like to shoot me. Any chemist here among the participants? I know you're going to ask yourself, sir, this molecule is difficult, it's going to be difficult to make out here. Yes, this molecule is extremely difficult to make because you see the backbone is chiefly made up of carbon entities out here. This is not an easy molecule to make synthetically. Okay. That is going to be difficult to make. It would use a large number of steps, some very complicated reactions, some very exotic reactions in order to make this molecule out here. It could be made, but the problem here is that if I make this molecule, the cost of making this molecule may be very high. The number of steps is also going to be very high, and that would drive the cost of my final product out here. So, and another thing, you begin to see that this molecule is very hydrophobic. And you know now, when you look at this structure, you'll get an inkling that this molecule is going to have very poor bioavailability. Pharmaceutics people are going to have very great problems in trying to make a formulation from it. I know all of you pharmaceutics people and medicinal chemistry people will shoot me for making this molecule out here. Okay, so what the next thing is to be done? Can we make a more realistic molecule that can be very easily synthesized and can have physicochemical properties that will make formulation easier out here? Okay, so here is the next big change out here. So we make small alterations with these 2 effects in mind, okay, to improve the water solubility and improve the physicochemical properties out here. So you begin to see this cyclopentadienyl ring has now been changed to a pyrrole, okay. In place of one of the carbon atoms, I've done an isosteric replacement. A methylene has been replaced with a sulfur. Chemists will appreciate, and I hope the pharmaceutics people will also appreciate out here. Okay, so I know that I've crossed the time and you're all hungry, and I too am hungry out here. Okay, there is a lot to talk about. I will stop at this time. Dr. Vivek and Dr. Galvina, if you permit me, I will stop. And maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions before we go for lunch. Okay, so here is, okay, using the tool that I talked about, okay, structure-based drug design. Here is how nelfenavir, you know about nelfenavir, an HIV-1 protein. Name is Viracept. Okay, nelfenavir, okay, was actually designed using structure-based drug design. Okay, so with that, I will end. I don't have time to talk about all of this thing. Okay, I'll have to ask the organizers, to give me about 3 hours lectures in order to talk about all the methods in molecular modeling. Okay, since I have a very short time, I must end with this. Thank you. I must end with this. Thank you all for your very patient hearing out here. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes before we break for lunch. We can take some questions if you have. Okay, sorry that I could not cover much more. Okay, molecular modeling is, the organizer would have given me more time, but it's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, sir. That actually was a very insightful session, providing us a new world and old world outlook on drug designing. So thank you very much. It was indeed, I mean, we could listen for it for more time. Here are a few
Shall,
questions I'd like to raise
shall
to
we
you.
skip lunch? And shall we have a working lunch and we talk more about molecular modeling? No,
It's it's up to the audience.
so what are the questions?
If
Yes.
agree, then I think we can. But as you also said that you are also hungry, if we can get some other time, for continuing. Sir, even I
Uh,
would have loved to listen to the whole thing, sir.
okay.
As
Now
all we start
Elvis will talk
afternoon
about
session
docking.
little late.
Yeah.
Okay. Elvis is talking about docking, so Elvis will cover another facet of molecular modeling. Okay. Okay, we'll take
Okay,
one or
sir.
two lectures, take one or two questions.
Few questions, sir. Dr. Sandeep is asking which parameters should one consider to find a drug target while doing drug designing?
Okay.
Parameters to
So
consider drug target.
you're talking about druggability, right? Okay. Is
Yes,
that the question? Is about druggability? Hello?
perhaps yes.
So what is druggability? Okay, so there are many targets. So there are many targets which we have identified, but somehow we have not been able to identify small molecules that can actually modulate the functioning of the target. So druggability is the discovery of small molecules, okay, that can actually modify the working of the of your target, that can modulate the so what do I mean by modulate the target? Either I shut down the functioning of a target, or I keep its function still active or improve its functioning out here. Now mostly druggability is can be done, it's an experimental method. I do not know of any technique today, my molecular modeling technique, which can identify druggability of the targets using theoretical methods. This has to be done by experimental methods out here. So basically, you screen small molecules against your target and basically see how your target actually functions. Whether you have stopped its activity, for example, for an enzyme. Okay, so an enzyme does a certain catalytic cycle out here. Okay, so you basically begin to add small molecules as inhibitors, and you see whether you are able to shut down the catalytic cycle of your molecule out here. Okay, so druggability, to find small molecules in druggability, I think to the best of my knowledge, it is an experimental methods, and I don't think it is very easy to be able to use any of our molecular modeling techniques in order to find out about druggability. Okay, so to conclude, druggability should come by using experimental techniques, screening methods, screening small molecules against your target and seeing whether you are able to modulate the target.
Okay, so thank you. The second question is raised in a similar manner by Dr. Sandeep and Mr. Pankaj. What are basic requirements to go for ligand-based pharmacophore design? I
Okay.
repeat, basic requirements
Yeah.
to go for
Yeah.
ligand-based pharmacophore design.
Okay, so ligand-based pharmacophore design basically is you need a set of very active compounds. Okay, so if you can find 2 or 3 very active compounds, that is good enough. That is good enough. So identified very active compounds. Now this contrasts to basically QSAR. In QSAR, what you need is you need ligands which have a full range of activities. You need very active compounds, you need moderately active compounds, and even we have very poorly active compounds. If you have this set, then QSAR will benefit from this set. But for pharmacophore modeling, it suffices if you have 2 or 3 very active compounds. Okay, you scout for literature, pick up 2 or 3 more active compounds, and you can use the tools in pharmacophore mapping in order to identify the pharmacophore. Okay, coming down to finding this active compounds. The only constraint here is basically in pharmacophore modeling is that the active compounds should have a lot of conformational restraint in them. That is the most important criteria. So when you look at active compounds, if they are very flexible, then you are going to have a great headache in pharmacophore modeling. It's going to be very tough. So the active compounds that you pick up in order to do pharmacophore modeling, see that they have basically conformational inflexibility. As much as they are conformational inflexible, you are in a better position, you are better off in order to be able to identify the pharmacophore. So pick up conformationally restricted molecules, okay, in order to do a pharmacophore search. So to conclude, get very active molecules and get those molecules which are conformationally restricted with a very limited number degrees of conformational freedom. Then you are in a good position to start your pharmacophore mapping.
Thank you, sir. Another question is from Ms. Archana Gujar. What is reverse docking concept?
Okay. So docking is basically what you take a ligand and then you bind it to a pharmacological target, to a pharmacological target. So what I'm identifying, I have a pharmacological target, okay, which I'm interested to modulate, and then I basically screen molecules against this pharmacological targets, and I identify which are these molecules basically that can modulate the activity of this target out here. Most of the time, modulating the activity is shutting down the activity of the target. Okay, designing inhibitors if it's an enzyme, or designing antagonist if it's a if it's a receptor. Reverse docking is exactly the opposite. What you begin to screen, you screen a large number of targets, okay, against a given set of compounds, out there. So you do the reverse. So in docking, we have a large set of compounds, we have a library of compounds, and we screen them against a single pharmacological target. Okay, really not exactly. Sometimes, because we also want to know of activities, we also sometimes bind them to other targets out here. But essentially, in docking, we identify molecules which can modulate a target. In reverse docking, you do the opposite. You have a library of targets out here, and you screen them against a small set of compounds to see how they interact with these to bind to these compounds. So that is basically reverse docking, the exact opposite out here. Okay, so your library is basically essentially of pharmacological targets.
Thank you, sir. And we just take one last question owing to time restrictions, but definitely the next questions can be taken in session of Dr. Elvis. So this last question to you by Sapan Kamlesh Kumar. He said, sirs, I'm interested in synthesizing dual receptor inhibitor. Very few such drugs synthesized of the same type earlier. Targets are known. Which method is preferable, structure-based or ligand-based drug design?
Okay, so one of the very popular methods in order to basically design a molecule that can bind to two different targets is this hybridization technique. Have you heard about this hybridization technique? So in hybridization technique is, I know fragments which can modulate one receptor, and I know fragments which can modulate the other receptor, and then I use linkers and I use pieces in order to bind these two things together, to bind to these two things together. So using hybridization techniques, there are a lot of examples. Please refer to this hybridization techniques which people are basically used in order to bind to multiple targets out here. Of course, you can use the structures of only two ligands, okay, which are known to bind to these two different targets, and use your chemical intuition, use your synthetic knowledge in order to hybridize these two techniques. Is basically using scaffolds and bridges and linkers in order to link them out together very suitably, and that needs a lot of thinking. That needs a lot of thinking. But obviously, if you have the structures of these two targets, then after you have designed your molecule using this hybridization techniques, obviously then you can do docking in order to see how good they fit into these two receptors out here. Very obviously, you'll see that once you design it on paper, okay, and then you dock it into a target, you'll encounter some clashes, you'll encounter some steric bumps, you'll encounter some very bad bad things, and you'll have to go back and forth and redesign it. So very obviously, if you have the structure of the two targets, you are in a very enviable position, because you can dock your hybrid molecule, okay, to these targets and see for any this bumps and things which don't fit properly, or sometimes which protrude into the outer space and interact with water. You can do a lot with that. That gives you, once you have the structure of the target, as I said, you are in an enviable position. You can do a lot with it. Okay, what you have designed on the paper, if you can put it into the target side, you'll get, your vistas will open up in what else in what else you can do. But in the absence of the structure of the targets, then all that you have got to do is basically a hit and try method. Okay, design using the hybridization technique, design some molecules, then go and do some experiment and measure their activity and see whether you have improved or you have lessened the activity. You'll have to do this back and forth. But if you have the structure of the target, you can just push it into the target and see how good your hybridization has basically helped you out here. Okay, you can see if you have encountered any bumps and any structural changes that you basically need to do in order to bind snugly to both the targets out here. Okay.
So
Anything
thank you
else?
very much, sir, for your time. Yeah, ma'am, you would like to continue?
We have a lot of experts in molecular modeling inside the participants. I would like them also to give their suggestions. Okay, lot of experts are here I've seen in the participant list. So anybody wants to add, please you can add. We'll all profit from listening to you. Elvis is there. Is Meena there? Is Aarti there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah, you can add some of your wisdom so that we can all benefit from your wisdom. I know you're coming later on in the afternoon, but you can add to some of the things that I've suggested. Your own perspectives, your own views on this can help the audience.
So most of your lecture was very good enough. You covered up.
No. That is okay. Add what you want about the questions that the participants asked. You want to add your own different insights.
Any specific question you want to add my insights into?
No. Just now they asked these questions. You want to add any more insights of your own into your different perspective of your different outlook in my answers to them?
Oh, yeah. But the last, the one that you spoke about, the dual inhibitors, where you take in the fragment. Now that has given rise to a completely new field called as PROTACs, where you are going to tag into some linkers to two different linkers, and you're going to, make that protein into a forced degradation by tagging into a ubiquitin system. That is why exactly they use dual inhibitors by linking them into two linkers. So that, yeah, I guess that's it.
So can I add something about the pharmacophore thing that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure.
So, sir, we can create a pharmacophore using 2 or 3 really active molecules, and as you said, restricted. But if we can also look at the inactive molecules and try to subtract those pharmacophoric features, then we could get a molecule which is really active.
So yeah, thank you. So after that you do those volume based wet, disallowed areas and all that you do. You can cut off all those pieces. Okay, later on you can do all of those things also. Okay, volume excluded. Remember that in pharmacophore modeling, the last step is volume exclusions.
Yes, sir.
The last step. Yes, you can do that. Yes, thank you. You can add all of those things and do that.
Thank you for the insight about using the restricted molecules, because that is really a tip from you, which we can all use.
Because fundamentally you need the three-dimensional structure of your molecule in order to do pharmacophore modeling. So if you have too many degrees of freedom, too much of conformation flexibility, then identifying the bound structure, the active structure, is a big headache. Unless somebody has determined it by NMR or by X-ray crystallography, if you have the bound structure or the active site structure, then you're in an enviable position. But in the absence of that information, to search the configurational space and the conformation space of this molecule, if you have highly flexible, you will identify one structure which will turn out to be not the receptor bound structure, and then your pharmacophore modeling will all go haywire. So that is the need for having restricted analogs, because then you limit the search space to the active to the receptor bound conformation. Okay, Galmina, I think we need to stop here and participants need to go for lunch for the next session. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Aarti ma'am. Thank you, Elvis sir. And thank you, the participants, for attending and your patient hearing. We now conclude the session 2 of this FDP. We will resume on the third session. There's slight change in timings. The third session will begin at 3 o'clock. The third session will begin at 3 o'clock. Thank you. You'll be using the same link to join in again. So till then, take a break. Thank you.